Perhaps you have seen the quip, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind, typed into a social media post, or emblazoned on a bumper sticker appearing at a stoplight, or proclaimed from a button affixed on a stranger's backpack. The quote is often attributed to Mohandas K. Gandhi, although I cannot attest to the historical accuracy of that. Certainly, Gandhi is not the first spiritual leader to quarrel with the retributive justice that is meted out in the call for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. As Lynn observed in her marvelous touchstone reflection this morning, Jesus of Nazareth argued against that, as did Martin Luther King Jr. Whenever we read or hear that particular turn or phrase, it stays with us. It's just so pithy. Gandhi was known by his fellow Indians for his wit as well as for his wisdom. "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians," he is reported to have said. "Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Yet he did admire some Christian teachings on nonviolent resistance that came to him via Aden Ballou in America and then from Ballou's devotee, Leo Tolstoy, in Europe. Gandhi was able to synthesize their insights with teachings from his own Hindu tradition on ahimsa, the principle of non-injury, and satyagraha, the principle of truth force. Gandhi emerged as a global icon for peacemaking only after he traveled internationally and intervened locally. He was a citizen of his country as much as he was an ambassador of goodwill to the world. Born in 1869 along the Indian coast, Gandhi himself was a child of empire, growing up under British colonialist rule. As a young man, he went abroad to University College in London to study law. Following graduation, he went overseas to South Africa, where he would practice as an attorney for more than 2 decades. While he considered himself a British citizen, it quickly became plain to him that he was not treated as other Britons were in South Africa. Confronted with racial discrimination and racialized violence, he soon became a vocal advocate for civil rights. In 1915, he returned to India, where he got involved in provincial government and community organizing. In the wake of World War I, he began lobbying for Indian independence. Only after World War II, in 1947, would that campaign finally be won in his homeland. Gandhi's best-known initiative was the 1930 Salt March, which spanned nearly 250 miles to the coast. Along the way, he gathered thousands of followers who were willing to violate the colonial laws that prevented Indians from harvesting their own salt from their own seas. Collectively, they demonstrated the power of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to alter public opinion. And the Salt March would later give civil rights activists in the United States a model for mass action. To Gandhi's way of thinking, though, they were not attempting something new. They were simply employing the timeless instruction of the Hindu sages from earlier millennia. "I have nothing new to teach the world," Gandhi contended. "Truth and nonviolence are as old as the hills." They may be so, but they are not as readily visible as those hills on the horizon. Gandhi opened people's eyes up to the promise they might hold. Like King after him, Gandhi lost his life to violence. He was shot by a Hindu extremist at a prayer meeting in January 1948, just a couple of short weeks before King would be ordained to the Christian ministry. But Gandhi's legacy would endure well beyond his assassination. Not only would he be revered by Indians as a founder of their nation, he would later influence such luminaries as Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu in their struggles. to liberate South Africa from an apartheid government. The United Nations directed that its International Day of Nonviolence be observed on October 2nd, which is Gandhi's birthday, as a tribute to all he did during his lifetime to demonstrate the universal relevance of the principle of nonviolence and to advance a culture of peace, tolerance, understanding, and nonviolence everywhere. Indeed, Gandhi immediately leaps to mind when we UUs declare our indebtedness to the sacred words and deeds of prophetic women and men which challenge us to confront powers and structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. These days, we have multiple occasions to recall his words and deeds. According to Gandhi, nonviolence is the greatest force at the disposal of humankind, mightier than the mightiest weapon of destruction devised by the ingenuity of humans. But it may prove far more difficult for us to wield effectively and employ in emergency situations. Gandhi knew that before nonviolence could successfully be adopted as a popular strategy, it had to be carefully developed as an individual and communal spiritual discipline. Nonviolence is not a garment to put off and on at will. It must be an inseparable part of our being. Nonviolence, which is a quality of the heart, cannot come by an appeal to the brain, Gandhi maintained. It is a plant of slow growth, growing imperceptibly but surely. The future depends upon what we do in the present. It is possible to live in peace. It becomes increasingly possible if we become increasingly devoted to cultivating nonviolence in our own lives and communities, if we tend to that sort of existence with wholehearted intention. That's much easier said than done, obviously. These days, some forms of violence are so subtle that they can almost escape our notice. In these United States, we are not living in wartime. We are not actively overturning our government. We are not living with persistent civil unrest, although we do sometimes see protests and vigils and uprisings in response to continued injustice in this country, particularly in response to police brutality, which both Gandhi and King knew firsthand. We Americans always read about the latest mass shooting with some combination of anger and horror. And yet, we watch shockingly violent movies and television shows and consider them entertaining. We join young children in playing video games featuring gunfire that feels very nearly real and insanely lethal, such that no one could keep up with the body count if there were not an electronic scoreboard. We spend time on social media platforms where death threats are made publicly, and short of that, where people are menaced by threats to their bodily integrity or livelihood or professional reputations or social connections or basic dignity. We watch so-called news shows where rivals try to shout each other down. It is a gross understatement to say that we Americans do not have nonviolent habits of mind. Our contemporary context is so saturated in graphic violence that we often cease to observe it, let alone object to it. We need to name and notice violence for what it is whenever we are faced with it. Whether we face the reality of it, the threat of it, or a glorified depiction of it. In addition, we need to understand that there are many expressions of violence besides the physical. There's also psychological, social, and spiritual violence. All of these are routinely inflicted and on vivid display across the internet, We teach school children to interrupt bullying on the playground, but it's not something we adults seem to have mastered for ourselves in our own workplaces or other arenas. We may even be tempted to justify our bullying tendencies because we have such worthy ambitions or social agendas or political aims. But these attitudes pollute our causes as well as our communities. Too often, we willingly participate in a cancel culture based on groupthink and purity tests. Gandhi declared the first principle of nonviolent action is that of non-cooperation with everything humiliating. The first principle, that is its very starting point, the place from which all nonviolence proceeds. The refusal, categorical refusal, to participate in any form of humiliation of anyone, friend or foe. Unfortunately, we frequently turn a blind eye toward harassing and hostile behaviors we see in our community because we have failed to develop sufficiently robust repertoire of clear, nonviolent responses. We can feel trapped in primitive frameworks where people either seem to be winning or losing ongoing arguments, where they appear to be greater than or lesser than and power brokering, where everything becomes a contest for social dominance, such that we prevail only when our opponents are either annihilated or silenced or exiled or humiliated. Who got the last word? Perhaps we need to know because we still want the satisfaction of speaking it ourselves. We cannot be surprised to live in such polarizing times when we ourselves become polarizing figures, when our sanctimony or smugness or self-congratulation are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We track how we rank in competitive virtue posturing. We care about having the sort of lawn signs and flags and bumper stickers and buttons and social media posts that not only declare our allegiance to certain values, but also shame and blame our neighbors in the process. Mind you, making others appear wrong does not mean that we have gotten anything right ourselves. Quite the opposite. Like Jesus, Gandhi refused to hate his evident enemies because he knew that if he did, he would be in danger of resembling them more and more closely. Jesus had some pithy sayings of his own. He, too, had a great sense of humor. My favorite quip of him is a question, actually. You'll hear varying translations of it, but this is it at its pithiest. Why do you look so closely at the splinter in another's eye and ignore the plank of wood in your own eye? How can you comment on another's eye, Jesus asked, when your own vision is so obviously distorted? First, remove that plank of wood from your own eye and focus on seeing things more clearly, he tells us. We can start by recognizing our own deep-seated impulses toward aggression. Faith communities such as UU Wellesley Hills give us a place to do just that, to witness our manifold failings with a degree of compassion and curiosity. They give us practice ground for developing a profound vision of nonviolence and peaceful coexistence. They encourage us to tap our religious imaginations and see novel possibilities for human interactions, both on a small and on a large scale. Recently, this congregation got a thank you note from an optician at Community Health Connections in Fitchburg, where we donated a few bags of our old eyeglasses. Through the generosity of your congregants, I've been able to have not one patient leave my office unable to see, she wrote. Vision is a word that can mean what we literally see, but it also means being able to think about the future with a degree of imagination. When I say to my patients, we had an entire church come together to help you see, it helps their literal vision, and it also starts a conversation, she added. It allows my patients and I to share a vision of a kinder world where people do good things for one another because it's the right thing to do. May this church give all of us eyes to see the kind and decent and true ever more clearly, and encourage us to correct for any blindness to violence and injustice and bullying. Times like ours require tremendous vision and imagination. As the greatest spiritual teachers throughout the ages have reminded us, the two are barely indistinguishable from one another.